The order was 9 words long. Secure the Brécourt battery. Do not fail this command. It arrived at 0347 hours on June 6, 1944, scrawled on a piece of paper that had been folded 4 times and handed to a man who had not slept in 31 hours. The paper was already wet. Everything was wet. The fields of Normandy in the early morning of D-Day were soaked with rain, with blood, and with the absolute certainty of men who had planned something that could not possibly go wrong. The Brécourt Manor battery held 4 105mm howitzers aimed directly at Utah Beach. Those guns had the range to kill thousands of Americans before the first wave could reach the seawall. Allied intelligence had identified the battery. Allied planning had assigned a unit to neutralize it. The system, they believed, was airtight. It wasn't. The unit that arrived at the edge of those fields that morning found something the aerial photographs had not shown, something the French resistance contact had not warned them about, something that every map at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had simply failed to capture. The Germans were waiting. So here is the question this story will answer. When the plan collapses, completely, instantly, catastrophically, what is the thing that saves you? Is it training, courage, luck, or is it something that one supremely calm general in a pressed uniform had been quietly building for 2 years? Something so deep in the bones of every American soldier that it worked even when the man himself was 300 miles away. June 4th, 1944. Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. 52,000 square miles of ocean. 11,000 aircraft, 5,000 ships, 156,000 men assigned to cross the English Channel in the largest amphibious assault in human history, and one man who could not sleep. Dwight David Eisenhower stood at a Rain Street window at 4:15 hours and made the decision that would define the century. The weather was wrong. The window was closing. Every meteorologist on his staff gave him a different number. He looked at the reports, looked at the ceiling, and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Okay, we'll go." 3 words, the fate of the world. But what is remarkable about Eisenhower is not the decision itself. Decisions at that scale happen in an instant. What is remarkable is what he had spent the preceding 2 years building so that decision could survive contact with reality. Because Eisenhower understood something that most generals never learn. The plan is only the opening bid. The operation is what happens when the plan meets the ground. And the man who would discover exactly how true this was, the man who carried Eisenhower's doctrine into a field in Normandy at dawn, was First Lieutenant Richard D. Winters, age 26, from Ephrata, Pennsylvania. Winters was the executive officer of Easy Company, 6th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. He was not supposed to command the assault on Brécourt Manor. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, was dead, killed when his C-47 transport was hit over the coast, the plane going down with all aboard before a single boot touched French soil. Command had passed to Winters without ceremony, without warning, and without a moment to adjust. He had a photograph in his breast pocket. His mother, standing in front of the house on Mulberry Street, squinting slightly into the sun, smiling the way she always smiled when she didn't want him to know she was worried. He hadn't looked at it since England. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where it was. Easy Company had jumped into Normandy at 01:16 hours on June 6th, scattered by anti-aircraft fire, blown off course by winds, men dropping into flooded fields, into trees, into enemy positions they couldn't see. By the time Winters had assembled what he could find of his company near Saint-Mère-et-Joie, he had fewer than 15 men. The 56th PR had jumped with 800 paratroopers. Fewer than a third had landed within a mile of their intended drop zones. This was not the plan, but this was, in a precise and documented sense, exactly what Eisenhower's command philosophy had prepared for. Eisenhower had written explicitly in his command guidance to SHAEF and in his training directives to every division under his authority about what he called initiative within intent. The language was simple. Every officer and NCO must understand the commander's goal well enough that, if the plan fails, he can find another way to achieve that goal without waiting for new orders. This was not a suggestion. It was a doctrine. It was baked into every training exercise, every after-action review, every command school that processed American officers between 1942 and 1944. Winters knew the intent. Brécourt Manor battery. Neutralize it. Utah Beach. Protect it. The mission existed whether or not the plan did. And so, when a runner arrived at 0340 hours with that 9-word order, secure the Brécourt battery. Do not fail this command. Winters didn't need to be told twice. What he did not yet know was that the intelligence picture behind those 9 words was built on a lie. 3 days earlier, at the German 709th Infantry Division command post in Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Hauptmann Werner Poskat, the officer commanding coastal defense in the sector, had received a summary report from divisional intelligence. The report assessed Allied airborne intentions and capabilities. It was contemptuous. The American paratroopers are administratively capable soldiers, the assessment read, but psychologically unprepared for independent action under fire. Their command structure depends entirely on radio coordination and written orders. Remove the radio and you remove the unit's ability to function. Eisenhower's command system is the system of a manager, not a warrior. It will not survive its first contact with a trained defensive position. Poskat had smiled reading it. He'd fought at Leningrad. He'd seen what Americans did in North Africa before the 1st Infantry Division learnt, slowly and at great cost, to fight. He'd circled the word manager and written in the margin, correct, he builds systems, we build soldiers. We will see which matters more. He was about to find out. Because at 0347 hours, 12 American paratroopers moving through a hedgerow east of Brécourt Manor were about to step into a field that no aerial photograph had correctly mapped, and the 4 German machine guns covering it were manned by soldiers who had been watching that hedgerow for 6 hours. Read those numbers again. 12 Americans. 4 machine guns. A field they couldn't cross, and they crossed it anyway. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Not the silence of an empty field, the silence of a held breath. Corporal Joe Toy, 23 years old, from Reading, Pennsylvania, a man so physically fearless that other Easy Company paratroopers thought he was simply incapable of feeling afraid, stalked at the edge of the hedgerow and held up a fist. Behind him, 11 men froze. Nobody spoke. The pre-dawn air smelled of wet grass and gunpowder residue from the naval bombardment offshore. Something's off, Toy said. Not a question, a statement. He was right. The road running along the south edge of the manor, shown on the briefing map as clear, recently confirmed by a French resistance contact named M.L. Fauvel, who had supposedly walked it the previous evening, showed fresh vehicle tracks in the mud. Multiple vehicles. Heavy ones. Moving east to west, moving toward the battery. Fauvel had not walked that road the previous evening. Fauvel had been arrested by the Gestapo 48 hours earlier. Someone had fed coordinates and route information to an Allied intelligence channel through Fauvel's compromised identity. The resistance contact was gone, and the information he had supposedly provided was German. Winters didn't know this yet. All he knew was the tracks. He sent Sergeant Bill Guarnere, 21 years old, South Philadelphia, built like a fire hydrant and possessed of a tactical instinct that bordered on supernatural, forward to check the hedgerow on the north side of the field. Guarnere had taken exactly 4 steps when the field exploded, not metaphorically. The German MG-42 opened at a range of 60 meters. The first burst caught the ground 2 inches in front of Guarnere's left boot. He was moving before his brain registered the sound, combat instinct overriding cognition, diving left into the hedgerow base as the second burst passed through the space where his chest had been. 3 more guns opened simultaneously. The field became a geometry of tracer fire, interlocking fields of fire laid out with the precision of a defensive position that had been constructed and rehearsed. This was not a patrol. This was a prepared position. The Germans had known exactly where the Americans would approach. Sergeant Donald Malarkey, 22, Astoria, Oregon, was hit in the right arm in the first 4 seconds, not fatally, but his rifle arm. He pressed himself into the hedgerow mud and tried to determine if his fingers still worked. They did. Barely. Private First Class Prief Gerald Lorraine took a round through his left thigh and went down without a sound. He would later say he felt the impact before he heard the shot. A burning sensation, then the ground coming up to meet him with a certainty that was almost gentle. Winters was already moving, not away from the fire, but laterally reading the geometry. 12 men. 4 guns. A field he couldn't cross with 12 men. What could he cross it with? The radio crackled. Captain Lewis Nixon, S2 intelligence officer for the 56th, had somehow reached a frequency that could contact Winter's position. The message was precise, operational, and completely irrelevant to the reality on the ground. Easy Company is ordered to proceed to secondary objective, rendezvous with 3rd Battalion elements at Le Grand Chemin Crossroads by 5:33. Battery assault is being reassigned to Able Company. Winters stared at the radio for a moment. Able Company was 3 kilometers north. The last report from 90 minutes ago placed them in a firefight near Popville. They were not coming to Brécourt. They were not able to come to Brécourt. And the guns, the 4 105mm howitzers, were already firing, not at the paratroopers in the hedgerow, at Utah Beach. Every 6 minutes, a ranging round, then a battery salvo. The sound rolled across the Norman fields like something geological, a change in the earth itself. Those rounds were landing on American soldiers wading through 3 feet of surf with 60 pounds of equipment. Winters made his decision in approximately 4 seconds. He would not go to Le Grand Chemin. He would not wait for Able Company. He would not call back to confirm or request clarification. He understood the intent. The battery had to stop. The method was irrelevant. This was precisely what Eisenhower's doctrine had prepared him for, and he was about to execute it with 12 men. One of whom was down with a leg wound, and one of whom was operating on a bad arm, and all of whom had been awake for 37 hours. Meanwhile, at the Brécourt Manor battery command post, Lieutenant Friedrich Ritter, the battery commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, 31 years old, coldly professional, watched his position report come in and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The Americans had hit the outer defensive line exactly where his intelligence predicted. They had halted. They were calling for support that wasn't coming. The system was working. They will call for air support or artillery, he told his Feldwebel. Then they will wait. Then they will withdraw. Americans do not attack prepared positions with depleted forces. That is not in their doctrine. He was about to discover what was in their doctrine. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For the men who made that decision in the dark, with no backup and no guarantees, it is the least we can do. Here is what Eisenhower wrote in November 1943 in a command guidance memorandum circulated to all division commanders under his authority in the Mediterranean theater. The greatest danger to this army is not the enemy. The greatest danger is the assumption that when the plan fails, the mission fails. Plans always fail. The mission must not. The commander who cannot improvise to the commander's intent without waiting for new orders is not a commander. He is a clerk with a rifle. Read that again. That is not the language of a manager. That is the language of a man who understood that at the squad level, at the level of 12 men in a hedgerow in Normandy, the entire weight of Allied strategy rested on the judgment of one sergeant, one lieutenant, one corporal who had memorized not just his objective, but his commander's reason for wanting it. Winters lay behind the hedgerow and did exactly what that doctrine demanded. He read the position. He read the position. 4 guns. He could see where 3 of them were from the tracer geometry. The 4th was positioned somewhere behind the tree line to the northeast. It had fired late, which meant it had a limited arc of fire or was protecting a specific approach. The hedgerow system running north-south on the west side of the field was dead ground, below the gun's depression limits. If he could get men into that dead ground without being seen, he could approach the first gun position from the flank. He had 12 men. He needed 4 to lay suppressive fire. That left 8. 2 would escort Lorraine back. That left 6 to execute the assault. 6 men. Against a prepared battery position with a garrison estimated, incorrectly, as it turned out, at around 60 German defenders. Then he heard voices, civilian voices, in the farmhouse at the north edge of the manor grounds, behind a wall that backed directly onto the first gun position. A family had been sheltering since midnight. A man, his wife, their 2 daughters, ages 9 and 11. They had not fled. They had no car, no means of transport, and nowhere to go. The Germans had requisitioned their barn 3 days earlier and established a supply point 30 meters from their kitchen door. Winter's new plan required moving through the farmhouse approach. The family was directly in the line of any German counterfire that responded to an assault from that direction. Not hypothetically. Physically, if the Germans swung the gun, a 105mm howitzer, to cover a threat from the north, the farmhouse wall would not stop the backblast, that alone around. He could go another way. The alternative route took 4 minutes longer and crossed 40 meters of open ground under the 4th gun's field of fire. He looked at Malarkey. Malarkey looked back. "Your arm," Winters said. "Still there," Malarkey said. Winters chose the open ground. He chose the 4 minutes. He chose the 40 meters. He chose not to route his assault through a farmhouse with 2 children in it, even though it was the faster, cleaner path. He made this choice knowing it would cost more time, more exposure, more risk to his own men, and he made it in under 20 seconds. This is exactly what Eisenhower's command philosophy demanded, not blind adherence to the objective, not utilitarian calculations stripped of human weight. The doctrine said, Allied forces operate under the moral authority of liberation. Every tactical decision that compromises that authority undermines the strategic mission. Protecting French civilians was not sentimentality. It was strategy. Eisenhower had said it explicitly to his generals in Algiers in 1943, "The goodwill of the French people is an operational asset. Destroy a French family to save 5 minutes, and you have given the enemy a weapon that outlasts the battle." Winters had internalized this. It was in his bones. Now he had to exploit the one thing Lieutenant Ritter's overconfidence had left open. Ritter had positioned his reserve, 12 men, his Sturm group, on the east side of the battery, covering the most obvious Allied approach from the beach road. This was correct tactical doctrine. This was exactly where a textbook Allied assault would come from, if Allied doctrine were a textbook thing. It was not. The western hedgerow dead ground was unguarded because no sane attacking force would come from there. Too narrow. Too exposed at the entry point. Too far from any support. You'd have to assault from a position of complete isolation with no reserve, no radio contact, no artillery support, no air support, grounded since dawn by cloud ceiling, and no expectation of reinforcement. This was precisely and specifically the situation Winters wants. If this story has stayed with you, if you want to understand the decisions that shaped the world we live in, this channel needs your subscription to keep telling these stories. What does a system look like when it's working? It looks like 6 American paratroopers moving through a dead-ground hedgerow in Normandy at 4:18 hours on June 6, 1944, with 42 combined rounds of ammunition between them, guided by a doctrine built by a supreme commander who was 300 miles away on the far side of the English Channel. The gap was open. Winters moved. 4:18 hours, 6 men in a hedgerow, 42 rounds. Movers led from the front. Not because doctrine required it, Doctrine expressly warned company-grade officers against exposing themselves unnecessarily, but because the hedgerow was 12 inches wide and someone had to be first, he moved at a controlled crouch, weight forward, left hand trailing the foliage for feel, because his eyes were fixed on the gun position 30 meters ahead. The MG-42 to his right was still firing at the suppressing element he'd left behind. Garneret's team burning ammunition at controlled rate to hold German attention on the east side of the field. Every burst from that gun was buying Winters 6 seconds of movement. He counted the bursts, 22 steps between bursts if he pushed it. He pushed it. The first gun position was a sandbanked pit, 6 feet deep, with a 105mm howitzer pointed northwest due toward beach. 2 German gunners, a loader, an NCO with binoculars watching the ranging impacts on the beach 3 kilometers distant. Winters came out of the hedgerow low and fast. The NCO turned not fast enough. Winters shot him at a range of 4 feet. The 2 gunners reached for their weapons. Sergeant Carwood Lipton, 23, Huntington, West Virginia. The kind of man who remained extraordinarily calm in direct proportion to how bad the situation was, came through the hedgerow 3 seconds behind Winters and shot the first gunner before he had his carabiner unslung. The second gunner ran, in the wrong direction, directly into Gorner's suppressive fire on the east side. He didn't run far. Lipton, Winters, and Private First Class John Plesher threw themselves into the gun pit and pulled the firing mechanism breech out of the howitzer. Disabled. 1 gun down. 40 seconds. The second gun position was 25 meters north along the tree line, connected to the first by a communications trench. Winters could see it. He could also see that it was manned by 4 Germans who had heard the shots and were already turning their weapon, not toward Utah Beach now. Toward the hedgerow. They had 30 seconds before that gun found its new arc. He had no choice. He had no grenades. He had used his last in the opening engagement. The assault had to be frontal, across 25 meters of exposed ground between the tree line and the communications trench, with a turned gun about to track in their direction. He looked at Lipton. Lipton was already moving. Sergeant Bill Guarneret, 506th Pier, 101st Airborne Division, age 21, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, wrote in his after-action memoir, "When I heard the second gun go silent, and I knew Dick Winters was in those trenches with maybe 5 men against a garrison that should have had 60, I thought, this is the day this thing ends for Easy Company. I kept shooting because that's what you do. You keep shooting. You don't think about the math. You learn to stop thinking about the math somewhere around Sicily." The second gun went silent at 4:31 hours. Lipton had taken a round through the left side of his field jacket. The bullet passed through the fabric without touching him by approximately the width of 2 fingers. He didn't notice until afterward. He finished clearing the position, then looked down and saw the hole, and sat on the edge of the gun pit for approximately 4 seconds before standing back up. 4 seconds. That was Lipton's version of a breakdown. The third gun was where the plan stopped working for the last time. Between gun position 2 and gun position 3, Lieutenant Ritter had positioned his Sturmgruppe reserve, 12 men, in a covered trench running perpendicular to the American axis of advance, not as a blocking force, as a counterattack force. Ritter had calculated that if the eastern approach broke through, his reserve could sweep north and cut off any penetration before it reached the guns. He had not calculated for a penetration from the west. Nobody had calculated for a penetration from the west. But the Sturmgruppe was there, and they were facing the wrong direction by 90 degrees. But they were 12 men, and Winters now had 4. Lipton was still functional, Plesher was functional, and Private Gerald Lorraine had dragged himself forward on 1 good leg and 1 field-dressed wound because he had apparently not been informed that he was supposed to be incapacitated. 4 against 12. In the open. Here's what happens at this point when you are 4 men. Outnumbered 3-1, with no radio and no reserve and no air support and no artillery and no reinforcement coming. The doctrine either works or it doesn't. Winters did not order a frontal assault. He ordered a feint. Plesser and Lipton went right, visible, loud firing, while Winters and Lorraine went left through a shell-crater depression that wasn't on any map. The Germans shifted right to engage the visible threat. Winters came up behind the left end of their trench from 2 meters. At approximately 0447 hours, he dropped 2 grenades, his last, into the left section of the trench and charged the right section behind the detonation. The German line broke. Not all of it. 4 men held the far right end of the trench and fired back, hitting Lorraine a second time through the right shoulder, spinning him sideways. He did not go down. He fired left-handed with his remaining good arm at a target he should not have been able to hit. He hit it. The remaining Germans in the right trench section pulled back. 4 men, covering, tactical withdrawal. They were not routing. They were soldiers. They retreated in order. But they retreated. The 3rd gun position was now accessible. Winters and Lipton and Lorraine, bleeding from 2 separate wounds, refusing to stop, cleared the 3rd-tiered Hawk breech mechanism disabled, barrel spiked with a field improvised charge made from gunpowder emptied from artillery shells found in the supply crate beside the gun. The 4th gun, the one in the northeast tree line with the limited arc, was empty. The crew had fled during the assault on gun 3. 4 guns. 35 minutes. 4 paratroopers standing in a German battery position surrounded by dead and fled German soldiers, with Lorraine sitting on a shell casing holding his shoulder and trying to determine if he'd achieved full range of motion in his left hand. He hadn't, but he'd live. Winters keyed his radio. Static. He tried 3 frequencies. Static. He found a German field telephone, still connected to the manor house. He cut the line, then spliced it to his own radio in a field improvisation that violated approximately 4 regulations and worked perfectly. He reached battalion at 0501 hours. Brécourt battery neutralized. 4 of 4 guns disabled. Casualties, 2 wounded. Request medical evacuation at grid reference. On Utah Beach at that moment, the first wave of 4th Infantry Division was reaching the seawall. The 105mm guns that should have slaughtered them in the surf were silent. 2,500 American soldiers on Utah Beach who do not know their names, who will never know their names, walked up that beach because of what 12, then 6, then 4 men did in a hedgerow at dawn. At the Brécourt Manor command post, Lieutenant Friedrich Ritter received the report of the battery's fall at 0508 hours. He sat in silence for a moment. Then he sent a message to his divisional headquarters. Battery position overrun. Request confirmation of enemy unit designation and strength. The answer came back 40 minutes later, compiled from prisoner reports and field observation. 1 company, heavily under strength, no artillery support, no air support, no reinforcement. Ritter read the report twice. He wrote in his field diary, a document recovered by Allied forces in September 1944 in St. Lo, the following: "These were not the soldiers I was told to expect." By 600 hours on June 6, 1944, the field around Brécourt Manor looked like what it was: 4 gun pits, 8 German dead, an unknown number of withdrawn, 3 sandbagged ammunition caches that nobody had time to destroy, spent brass in the communications trenches, so many casings that they made a sound like gravel when you walked through them. The smell of cordite, so thick it tasted like copper on the tongue. And 4 Americans standing in the middle of it, watching the sun come through the Norman clouds for the first time that morning, not speaking. Gerald Lorraine was sitting against a gun pit wall with his shoulder packed and his field jacket soaked through on the right side, writing something in a small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. Nobody asked him what he was writing. They knew. Sergeant Carwood Lipton, 56, PR, 101st Airborne, age 23, Huntington, West Virginia, wrote in his post-war memoir, "When it was over, I sat on a crate and thought about calling home. You think about odd things after. I thought about whether my mother had gotten my last letter. Then Lieutenant Winters said, 'Good work.' And that was the whole ceremony. 2 words. That was enough. It was the whole ceremony. 2 words. That was the whole ceremony. 2 words. That was the mot." Weeks after the Brécourt engagement, as Allied forces pressed deeper into France through Saint-Lô toward Paris, German after-action analyses began to circulate through Wehrmacht divisional commands. They were not classified. They were meant to be instructional. They were meant to explain what had gone wrong. What they actually documented was the systematic failure of every assumption the German command had made about Eisenhower's army. Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding German's 7th Army, wrote in his operational assessment of June 10, 1944, 4 days after Normandy, that the Allied operation had succeeded not through superior firepower alone, but through an organizational coherence that permitted small units to operate without higher command direction in a manner consistent with strategic objectives. He noted that this characteristic was unprecedented in American forces as previously observed in the Tunisian and Italian theaters, and attributed it to a systematic training program whose depth we had not credited as operationally significant. He was right. He was right in the way that people who have fundamentally misunderstood something are right when they finally understand it, completely, and too late. In August 1944, as Allied forces prepared the breakout from Normandy that would eventually drive German forces back toward the Rhine, Eisenhower received a commendation report on the Brécourt Manor action. He had Easy Company recommended for the Distinguished Unit citation. In his personal diary that week, August 14, 1944, he wrote something that was not about Easy Company specifically, but that captured exactly what Brécourt represented. "The great question of command is not whether your plan will survive. It will not. The great question is whether your organization will." His had. Winters was promoted to captain. He led Easy Company through the Netherlands, through Bastogne, through the drive into Germany itself. He survived the war. He returned to Ephrata, Pennsylvania. He farmed. He rarely spoke about what happened in that hedgerow. When asked in his later years what he had been thinking in the moment he made the decision to attack, 12 men, prepared position, all the math pointing the other direction, he gave an answer that was perfectly Eisenhower in its construction. "I wasn't thinking about whether it would work. I was thinking about what it was for. Once you know what it's for, you stop worrying about whether it'll work. That is the doctrine. That is the whole of it. The plan fails. The mission doesn't. The organization holds." Think about what that means for a moment. Not in 1944, but now. Eisenhower built something that worked without him. The greatest test of any leader is not whether they can perform. It is whether the thing they built can perform without them, in conditions they never anticipated, at the hands of people making decisions they cannot supervise. Easy Company proved it could. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served under Eisenhower's command, in North Africa, in Sicily, on the beaches of Normandy, or in the frozen trenches around Bastogne, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What campaign? Where did they end up? What campaign? Where did they end up? Those stories exist in family memory and nowhere else. Share them here. They deserve to outlast us. Somewhere outside the village of Saint-Marie-du-Mont in Normandy, there is a field. The hedgerows are still there, the Norman bocage, unchanged for 1,000 years, the thick and green and impenetrable looking from the road. There is no monument at the specific site of gun position 1, gun position 2, gun position 3. There is a farm. There is a stone wall. There's a gate that creaks in the wind off the channel. And if you stand there on a June morning and listen carefully, through the wind and the bird song and the distant sound of the sea, you will not hear anything that happened there. But 80 years ago, in the space of 35 minutes, a small group of exhausted men stood in that field and proved something that changed the way armies understand themselves. They proved that the plan is not the Army. The Army is Richard D. Winters, Captain, United States Army, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, Ephrata, Pennsylvania. Died January 2, 2011, at age 92, 2011, at age 92. He asked that his death not be announced until after his funeral. He had spent 67 years avoiding exactly the kind of attention this story gives him. Some things you do because of what they're for. That's enough.